For decades, if you asked why Neanderthals went extinct, you'd get one of two answers. Either the climate turned against them, or modern humans outcompeted them into oblivion. Both explanations feel intuitive. Both have been repeated in documentaries, textbooks, and casual conversation for years. And according to a study published in February 2026, neither one actually holds up as the deciding factor. Led by Ariane Burke at the Université de Montréal, the research team behind this new work took a genuinely unusual approach to a very old question. Rather than starting from the fossil record or the archaeological layers most studies focus on, they borrowed a set of tools normally used in an entirely different field, conservation biology, the discipline dedicated to understanding why certain animal and plant populations survive environmental pressure while others collapse. Applied to prehistoric humans, that approach asks a different set of questions than paleontology usually does. Not simply what happened to Neanderthals, but what kind of landscape they were actually working with, how good habitat was distributed across Ice Age Europe, how that habitat held up through repeated climate swings, and crucially, how all the best patches of livable land were actually connected to one another. That last question turns out to matter enormously, and it points toward an explanation almost nobody outside specialist circles has spent much time discussing, not what the land could offer, but how well the people living on it could reach each other when things went wrong. This is the story of a theory that reframes Neanderthal extinction not as a story of failure, but as a story about the fragile, invisible infrastructure connecting one population to another and why, in the exact same landscape, that infrastructure held together for one species and quietly fell apart for the other. To understand why connectivity mattered so much, you first have to understand just how unstable the climate actually was during the specific window both species shared. Geologists call this stretch of time marine isotope stage 3, spanning roughly 60,000 to 24,000 years ago, and it wasn't simply cold. It was volatile, swinging repeatedly between colder glacial phases and warmer interstadial periods, sometimes within a single human lifetime. Forests would expand across a region for a few generations, then retreat as temperatures dropped again. Grasslands would open up, then close over. Rivers would swell with meltwater, then freeze solid the following winter. This wasn't the kind of slow, predictable climate shift you could plan multiple generations ahead for. It was closer to a landscape that kept changing the rules with little warning, forcing whoever lived there to adapt quickly or lose access to the resources they depended on. Both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens were navigating this same unpredictable stretch of European prehistory, often in overlapping territory, often facing genuinely comparable environmental pressure. That's actually what makes this such a useful natural experiment for researchers. If climate alone explained Neanderthal extinction, you'd expect it to have hit both species roughly as hard, since they were frequently occupying similar landscapes during the same volatile period. It didn't. One population persisted, adapted, and eventually spread across the entire continent. The other, after hundreds of thousands of years of successful survival in Europe, quietly disappeared within a relatively narrow window. Something beyond the weather itself was determining which populations could weather that instability and which couldn't. Here's where the conservation biology approach actually earns its keep. Burke's team built detailed habitat suitability models for both species, essentially mapping out, region by region, which parts of Ice Age Europe offered the resources either population needed to survive: fresh water, adequate tree cover, huntable game, and shelter from the worst extremes of the climate swings described earlier. And the first genuinely surprising result was this: suitable habitat, in a basic sense, wasn't actually the limiting factor for Neanderthals. The land they needed was frequently still there, even during difficult climate phases. What the models revealed instead was a pattern in how that good habitat was distributed across the landscape, sometimes clustered into a dense, overlapping network of connected patches, other times scattered as isolated pockets separated by difficult, resource-poor terrain that made travel between them genuinely hard. A band living in one of those isolated pockets might have had everything they needed locally, right up until conditions shifted and that local patch stopped being enough. When the researchers applied this framework specifically to the archaeological evidence, a genuinely important nuance emerged, one that's easy to miss if you're not paying close attention. This isn't a story about Neanderthals living in complete isolation, cut off entirely from other groups. Archaeological evidence clearly shows that Neanderthal communities did maintain contact with one another across real distances. Raw materials and worked objects turn up at sites far from their original source, exactly the kind of evidence that indicates deliberate movement, exchange, or at minimum regular contact between separate bands. Neanderthals were not, as older popular narratives sometimes suggested, hopelessly isolated, incapable of forming wider social ties. What the new modeling suggests instead is something more specific and, honestly, more interesting. The networks Neanderthal communities managed to build were comparatively fragile compared to the ones early Homo sapiens groups were forming across the same general period. Homo sapiens networks appear to have been more flexible, spanning greater distances more reliably, and apparently more resilient to sudden disruption. This distinction matters enormously once you factor the climate instability from earlier back into the picture. Picture two neighboring communities facing the exact same sudden cold snap, the exact same failed hunting season, the exact same unexpected disruption to their usual resources. A community embedded in a dense, well-connected network has options. They can draw on relationships with several neighboring groups, potentially relocate temporarily to a connected patch of better habitat, share critical information about where conditions remain favorable, or receive support through established, redundant social ties that don't depend on any single relationship holding firm. A community sitting at the edge of a sparse, fragile network has none of that flexibility. If their one or two significant outside connections happen to be disrupted at the exact moment they need help most, they're left to absorb the entire shock locally, with whatever resources happen to be immediately available in their own patch of habitat and nowhere else to turn. Multiply that basic dynamic across dozens of generations and hundreds of individual climate disruptions spanning tens of thousands of years, and the cumulative difference between a resilient network and a fragile one stops being a minor statistical detail. It becomes, according to this model, one of the single most important variables separating a population that persists from one that gradually, quietly, erodes toward extinction, not through any single catastrophic event, but through the slow accumulation of shocks a better connected neighbor would have simply absorbed and moved past. The regional patterns the study identified line up strikingly well with what the broader archaeological record has shown for years, which is exactly the kind of independent confirmation that makes a new theory genuinely credible rather than merely clever. On the Iberian Peninsula, at the western edge of Neanderthal range, the modeling found comparatively well-connected core regions, a network of habitable, linked valleys and coastal terrain that appears to have given local populations more flexibility and more resilience to disruption. And Iberia is, not coincidentally, exactly where some of the latest surviving Neanderthal populations in Europe have been documented archaeologically, persisting in places like Gibraltar longer than almost anywhere else on the continent. Central and Eastern Europe tell a noticeably different story. The modeling found regional connectivity in these areas to be considerably weaker, with Neanderthal populations there appearing more isolated from one another as conditions deteriorated through the later stages of this period. That's precisely the pattern you'd expect if fragile, poorly connected networks were a genuine driver of local extinction rather than a minor statistical footnote. Populations in well-connected refuges persisting longest, populations in poorly connected regions disappearing earliest. The story, notably, isn't uniform across the entire continent, which is itself an important, honest finding. This wasn't necessarily one single cause acting identically everywhere. It may well have been a broadly similar pressure, network fragility under climate stress, playing out with meaningfully different local outcomes depending on each specific region's underlying geography. This modeling work doesn't stand alone, either. It lines up with a separate, independent thread of evidence coming from ancient genetics. A Neanderthal individual known informally as Thorin, recovered from a cave site in France, carried DNA revealing something genuinely striking about his lineage's population history. Genetic analysis indicated his specific branch of the Neanderthal family tree had split off from other known Neanderthal populations roughly 100,000 years before he lived, and remained isolated from them for more than 50,000 years afterward, an extraordinarily long stretch of genetic separation for a single population occupying a relatively compact region of Europe. That kind of prolonged isolation typically comes with real biological costs, reduced genetic diversity, fewer opportunities to replenish a gene pool through outside contact, and a population gradually becoming less adaptable to changing conditions simply because it's drawing from an increasingly narrow genetic toolkit. Thorin's genome is essentially a molecular record of exactly the kind of network fragility Burke's spatial modeling identified from a completely different angle, using completely different methods, on a completely different dataset. One line of evidence comes from analyzing ancient DNA in a laboratory. The other comes from modeling habitat connectivity across an entire continent using tools borrowed from wildlife ecology. Both point toward the same underlying picture: small, thinly connected Neanderthal populations, gradually cut off from the wider genetic and social exchange that might have helped them weather an increasingly unpredictable world. It's worth being clear about what this theory does and doesn't claim, because it would be easy to oversimplify into something the actual research doesn't support. This isn't an argument that Neanderthals were less intelligent, less capable, or somehow inferior to early Homo sapiens in some general sense. The evidence for sophisticated Neanderthal behavior, tool use, and even symbolic activity has only grown stronger in recent years across completely separate lines of research. This is instead a claim about social infrastructure and demographic resilience, the kind of thing that can determine a population's fate almost independently of individual intelligence or capability. A perfectly capable, resourceful community can still collapse if it's repeatedly cut off from the wider network of relationships that would otherwise help it absorb unpredictable shocks. Homo sapiens groups moving into and across Europe during this same period appear to have built and maintained exactly that kind of resilient network more consistently than Neanderthal communities managed to, for reasons the current research doesn't fully explain, and that likely involves some combination of group size, mobility patterns, and social structure still being actively studied. The eventual outcome wasn't necessarily a story of one species defeating another through direct confrontation. It may have been a much quieter, more structural story, one population's social safety net simply proving more durable than the others, across tens of thousands of years of a genuinely unstable world. There's also a broader lesson embedded in this research that extends well beyond a single extinct species. The core insight, that connectivity between populations can matter as much as the quality of any single location, is a principle conservation biologists have documented repeatedly in modern wildlife populations facing habitat fragmentation today. Species confined to isolated, disconnected patches of otherwise perfectly adequate habitat consistently show higher extinction risk than species maintaining connections across a wider, linked landscape, even when the total amount of available habitat looks similar on paper. Applying that same well-established ecological principle to a 50,000-year-old human population isn't just a clever research trick, it's a genuine reminder that the biological rules governing survival and extinction don't stop applying just because the organism in question happens to be a close relative of ours rather than a modern songbird or amphibian. Neanderthals lived successfully across an enormous stretch of Europe and Western Asia for roughly 360,000 years before this final, difficult chapter of their history. Whatever ultimately tipped the balance against them likely wasn't a single dramatic cause, but rather the slow, compounding disadvantage of thinner, more fragile social connections during exactly the stretch of time when those connections mattered most. So here's where this theory leaves the old, familiar story. Not climate alone. Not simple competition, with one species outright defeating another. Something quieter, and in some ways more unsettling. Two closely related populations, occupying largely similar landscapes, facing largely similar environmental pressure, separated in the end by how well each managed to stay connected to its own wider community when conditions turned difficult. It's a theory that reframes extinction not as a story about strength or intelligence, but about the invisible, easily overlooked infrastructure of relationships that determines whether a population can absorb a bad decade, or whether it simply has nowhere left to turn. Which part of this actually stays with you the longest? That the habitat itself usually wasn't the real problem, that Iberia's better connected populations genuinely did survive longer than Central and Eastern Europe's more isolated ones, or that an entire species' fate may have quietly come down to how strong its social network happened to be? Drop your take below, and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. Subscribe for the next deep dive into the theories this field is only just beginning to take seriously.